What's up? Welcome to Storyform Preaching. My name's Danny, and in this video, I'm going to equip you to supercharge your next sermon introduction with the tools of story formation. For me, writing the introduction is often the most daunting task of preparing a sermon. Where do you start? What do you introduce? How deep do you get into the text in the introduction? Do you need some catchy story or some hook? How long should your introduction take? We're going to answer all these questions and more today. But let me start with a bold claim. If you understand a few basic principles of story formation, the introduction becomes a lot less mysterious and a lot more powerful. Let me tell you what I mean. The other day I was watching the Pixar movie Toy Story. Full disclosure, I have a bunch of kids. And I was struck when I was watching the movie with how well the introduction of the film set up the entire story. And even more, I was struck with how translatable the principles of introduction are into the craft of biblical preaching. Well, we don't think about this a lot, but every movie we've ever watched, every book we've ever read has an introduction. They call it Act 1. It's about 25% of the total length of the film, and it draws you into the film while equipping you with some basic tools you need to enjoy the movie you're about to watch. In Toy Story, as the example we use today, the film begins in Andy's bedroom, where a Western scene has been created with all his different toys. This is where we meet Woody, the main character of the film, the king of the toy room, outfitted in Western garb. Andy praises Woody for saving the day. Woody calls Andy my favorite deputy, and then the cheesy song starts playing, "You Have a Friend in Me." But then, to Woody's dismay, something terrible happens. A new toy is introduced into the toy room. Flashy, shiny, electronic Buzz Lightyear. And Woody doesn't like it one bit. In fact, he tries to sabotage Buzz almost immediately. But his sabotage backfires, and he and Buzz tumble out the window outside of the toy room to the street below, and we're swept into Act 2. The million-dollar question we're going to answer in the next few minutes is this: how do we distill the principles from this Pixar film and translate them to the craft of biblical preaching? If you're new to the overlap between story formation and expository preaching, you should do a deep dive into our YouTube channel and take a moment to subscribe while you're doing it. Because everything we do in story form preaching is designed to improve your next sermon with the tools of story formation. For now though, suffice it to say, every sermon that's designed to take an audience on a journey of discovery through the text of Scripture is inherently a work of narrative. And since every sermon is inherently a work of narrative, we can use the tools of narrative, the tools of story formation, to write better sermons. Act 1 in Toy Story is fun, unique, compelling, but it's also built on a basic formula that's used in every film, book, or story. And in the next few minutes, I'll teach you what this formula is and how it applies to your next sermon introduction. And just for fun, I'll throw in some advice on supercharging your conclusion too. You can catch that at the end of this video. Okay, with that, let's leave the toy room and enter the real world of sermon preparation. The big question we need to answer in sermon preparation, writing introductions, is this: what is your introduction supposed to introduce? So let me give you 3 principles of what introductions are supposed to introduce today. First principle: your introduction should introduce your main character, their world, and their pre-transformed state. In Toy Story, we meet Woody in the toy room. Before going on the 90-minute adventure that is the film, we learn that Woody rules the roost and loves it. In fact, in the opening scene, we get to watch as Woody swoops in and saves the day. We get a glimpse of Woody's fears in the introduction, losing his authority, his greater fear of being replaced by others. We feel the tension rising as we hear about the family moving to a new home. And in the introduction, we get to meet Woody's arch nemesis, Buzz Lightyear, who represents moving into the future where being replaced or forgotten is a distinct possibility. Now, as much as this doesn't feel like preaching, let me show you how a sermon introduction does the exact same thing. You have an audience who you're planning to take on a journey through the text of Scripture, but before you start this journey, you need to devote some time to helping them look in the mirror and see where they are today in relation to this biblical topic before stepping into the passage. Imagine, for our purposes today, that your passage is about loving your neighbor as yourself. It's the Good Samaritan passage. Before you dive into the main body of your sermon, you need to show your audience how they relate to loving their neighbor right now, in their pre-transformed state. Maybe you start with a story about how your kids make friends so easily at the park, and then you ask this question: why is this concept so much harder as adults? Maybe you wrestle with some of our fears or insecurities around this topic, and then introduce your congregation to the text of Scripture that's going to pull them out of the playroom window and into the sermon world in a moment. We'll talk later about how to actually structure this introduction, but for now, take this to the bank. Your introduction should introduce your main character, your congregation, their world, and their pre-transformed state. Ready for principle number 2? Here it comes. Principle number 2 of introduction writing is that your introduction should introduce the theme of your sermon. The theme of your sermon. It's fascinating. So often in movies, near the very beginning, one of the characters has a seemingly insignificant line that ends up becoming the theme of the entire movie. In the film Blank Check, in the first couple of minutes, one of the characters mentions the golden rule. Namely, in that movie, he who has the gold makes the rules. In Toy Story, after the initial fear of replacement emerges in the community, Woody tries to calm the fears of his friends with a line that actually becomes the theme of the film. Woody says it this way: "It doesn't matter how much we're played with. What matters is that we're here for Andy when he needs us. That's what we're made for, right?" In the moment, this line doesn't feel significant. But in retrospect, we realize this little line encapsulates the theme of the entire movie. I love to take this principle into my preaching and find a way to explicitly state the theme of the sermon in the first couple of minutes. Sometimes I do this in the very opening line. I'll say, the command to love our neighbor can be more challenging than we ever realized. Other times it fits better after an opening illustration. I'll say, watching how easily my kids connect with perfect strangers makes me wonder, why is it so difficult for us to love people we don't know? Sometimes I even switch it up, like in movies, and I craft a theme statement for the beginning of the sermon that the text actually refutes when we get into the main body. I'll say something like this: surely when Jesus told us to love our neighbor, he didn't mean all of our neighbors, right? So try it in your next sermon. Write a simple theme statement and plant it into the first few minutes or even the first few seconds of your sermon. See what happens as you introduce the theme in the introduction. Okay, let's pause for a moment. Imagine you incorporated these first 2 principles into a sermon on loving your neighbor. You start with a theme statement. We all know Jesus calls us to love everyone, but it doesn't mean everyone, right? Then you move on to introduce the life of your audience before encountering the text of Scripture. You tell a story about a neighbor who's hard to love. You ask them who are the hard to love people in their lives. You tell them, today we're going to look at a text in Scripture where Jesus wrestles with this very question: who is my neighbor? On one hand, this is a solid introduction. But on the other hand, there's still something missing. A component that moves this sermon from a mere lecture on neighboring to a transformative experience in the text of Scripture. What's the missing piece? It's our last key principle to supercharge your next sermon introduction. Principle number 3, your introduction should connect with the heart of your audience. The heart of your audience. There's a moment in every work of narrative, whether it's a book, a film, an oral story, it's called the inciting incident. And it usually happens about a third of the way into the introduction. It's a moment where one of 2 things happens to the main character. Either they're invited into something that they've always wanted, or something they love is taken away irrevocably. In the movie Blank Check, you might have guessed it, the kid is handed a blank check that he later writes for $1 million. That's the inciting incident of Blank Check. In Toy Story, Woody encounters this new toy, Buzz Lightyear, who threatens to take away his spot as Andy's favorite toy. It's so interesting to compare this inciting incident concept to the theme statement of a sermon. If the theme of Toy Story revolves around being there for each other is what really matters in life, the inciting incident connects with that piece of the main character's heart that threatens the reality of that theme. In Woody's case, his stumbling block to being there for others is his fear of being unwanted or no longer needed. You can probably start to tell why this is a powerful tool for preaching. If we're about to preach a sermon on being people who love our neighbor well, we need to build an inciting incident that tackles a real-life obstacle that gets in the way of us living out this truth. So, what is it? What literally stops people in your church from loving their neighbors well? Is it apathy, busyness, selfishness, or the people we are called to love just simply not on our radar? If you need help kind of crafting what your inciting incident is, look to the passage you're preaching. In the Good Samaritan passage, we see the obstacle is fear, it's hatred, and it's even their theology about who God has truly called them to love. If I was deciding to preach this message this week to my church, I might encapsulate it with a phrase like this. I'd say we'd all have reasons we know we're not great at loving our neighbor well, but what if the real problem is deeper? What if the reason we don't love our neighbor with our actions is because we truly don't love our neighbor in our heart? You know you've written a good inciting incident when you drop the line in your sermon introduction and you can almost hear your audience just gulp. You can hear a pin drop. Now they're invested. You aren't just talking generally about loving well. You're talking to them personally about loving well. As we wrap up this video, let me give you an outline you can use to start to incorporate these principles into writing your next introduction. And if you want to go even deeper than we did in this video today, let me encourage you, head over to storyform.church and check out our free 30-minute webinar on getting unstuck in the sermon preparation process. In that video, we move on from introductions and give you more tips like these that will help you to write the entire sermon. As we scope this time today to the first 25% of your sermon, your introduction, here's a quick way to format. I'm going to give you 6 components of an introduction that you can utilize in their order. Number 1, state the theme. Number 2, give us a glimpse of the pre-transformed state of your audience. Number 3, drop your inciting incident. Number 4, wrestle with it with your audience a little bit. Number 5, introduce the biblical text. And number 6, lock in for the journey. Let me show you an abbreviated version of how this introduction could sound in real life. We all know that Jesus commands us to love our neighbors, but does he mean everyone? I have a neighbor named Pauline, and let me tell you, she is a person who is hard to love. I'll give some examples of why Pauline, who's a made-up person, is hard to love. Do you have someone like that in your life? Now, there are so many reasons we do a bad job loving people like these, right? Reason number 1, reason number 2, reason number 3, reason number 4. But I wonder, is the real reason deeper than any of these? What if the reason we don't love our neighbor with our actions is because we truly don't love our neighbor in our heart? I know what you're thinking. We wrestle. And I want to give you permission in the midst of this sermon to be honest for a moment, because in the text we're going to look at together today, we will see the people in Jesus' day struggled with the exact same thing. So here's the question I want to answer in our time together today. How can we become a people who love others so deeply that it overflows into the way that we live? And let's dive in. Now, that's pretty good, right? Now, before you go off and try it on your own, I want to share one last thing you can do with your introduction. This is your bonus principle. This is number 4. Take this to the bank. Your introduction needs to introduce your conclusion. Your conclusion. Now, here's what I mean. Your introduction of your sermon, the first 25%, and the conclusion of your sermon, the last 25%, can mirror one another. The story about failing that you give in your introduction can mirror a story about succeeding in your conclusion. The application points in your conclusion can address how to overcome the struggles you draw out in the introduction. You could even mirror the theme statement in your conclusion and write up a moral of the story that encapsulates your entire message. And if you want to take it to the next level, tell a story in the introduction that doesn't get fully resolved until the conclusion. The first 25% of your sermon and the last 25% of your sermon are like bookends that mirror one another and hold the whole content of your sermon together. In Toy Story, the movie, it ends the way it starts. Andy's opening gifts, just like he did in the Act 1 of the movie, and the toys are worried again about who the new person is who's joining them in the playroom. But Woody has a confidence that seems to be different now. He even turns to Buzz and he asks, "You aren't worried, are you?" And Buzz says, No. And then we hear a bark. The last line of the film is Andy saying, "Wow, a puppy." And then we zoom back through the window and get a close-up of Buzz and Woody. They look at one another with a half smile, half grimace, and laugh weakly. Thanks for watching the video today. Before you go, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and keep tuning in for more content on how to improve your next sermon with the tools of story formation.